Kesubos Daf Yud Zayin contains three sugyas. The Gemara discusses the simanim, the signs that were performed at the wedding of a basula to show that she was a basula, so everybody should know that she gets a ksuba of 200 forever after. This will get into a number of agadata discussing how they performed certain types of forms of simcha, certain songs that they sang, when those songs were sang in other circumstances. We'll then get into comparing the chashivas of a kala to that of a funeral. How do you show preference to one over the other? And those two against a Melech Yisrael, a king of the Jewish people, which one takes precedence over the other if they're traveling in their way on the road? The Gemara will eventually return back to our Mishnah and discuss Rabbi Yeshua's halacha that if someone claims that he says this was your father's piece of land, but I bought it from him, he's believed. The Gemara will want to know, why do we have to talk about your father's piece of land and not your piece of land? And the Gemara will give a couple of back and forth on that. So let's begin the Gemara. The Gemara says, we saw that there is a song that they sing in front of a kala. There's a simcha that they sing to show that she is a psula. What is that song? So the Gemara quotes a very famous Gemara. The Gemara says, what we say, according to Beis Shammai, we praise her for whatever praises she has. If she's ugly, we don't say that she's beautiful, and whatever quality she has, those are the ones that we point out. Now, Beis Hillel says, no, you say she's beautiful and charming, no, whatever she is. Just the fact that she's a kala, you want to make her beloved to her husband, you say nice things about her, whether they're true or not. Obviously, you try to make them believable, you would assume, but there's always a chutzah chesed, there's a sense of grace over the fact that she is a kala. So the Gemara says, Beis Shammai said, what do you mean? If she was lame or she was blind, you're going to say that she was beautiful and charming? It's not true. Do we not say, midbar sheker tircha, keep away from falsehood? So Beis Hillel said back to Beis Shammai, how do you understand? If somebody goes to the market and they buy something and it's a bad deal, they made a bad deal, so you're going to tell them, hey, you made a bad deal, you're stupid? You're going to tell them, okay, great deal. You try to say something that's nice that people will feel good about, and he made the deal already anyway, give him a chance to enjoy it. So the same thing applies here. He's marrying the woman anyway. There's no reason to make him feel that it was bad. Try to make it feel like he should be happy with it. Says the Gemara, based on this, you should always have your mind be mingled with the people. It means you should always understand people and always be amenable and compatible with what other people are feeling and act accordingly. Okay, now another potential song that they would sing for the kala, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that this is what they used to sing in Eretz Yisrael. They used to sing, no eye makeup, no blush, no braids, but she still has beauty. And this was, again, to show that she didn't need any of those things. Her beauty was natural and internal. Where it says the same song was sung when they gave smicha to Rabbi Zera. It was a compliment to him to show that even without externals, he still had grace. He still radiated the proper tzidkos that he should. Says the Gemara, another song that was sung at a smicha, when Rav Ami and Rav Asi got smicha, they sang, anyone like this should be musmachim for us. These are the people who we want to be musmachim on us. These are proper to have smicha, not as opposed to the sarmisin or the sarmitin, or to a different version, the chamisin or the turmisin. What are these? So sarmisin is someone who distorts the halacha. Sarmitin is a rag, meaning that he claims to know the halacha, but he doesn't really, just like a rag claims to cover you, but it doesn't really. Chamisin is from the word chamesh, Rashi says, meaning 1/5, that they only know 1/5 of what they're supposed to know, or they only explain 1/5 of what they're supposed to explain. Tormisin, Rashi says he doesn't know what that has to do with anything over here. Tormisin is a type of a bean. Others explain that just like this bean has a very bitter, uncomfortable flavor, we don't want someone to be our musmach who is bitter and unamenable as well. Now, one more song that happened is when Rabbi Avo would leave the yeshiva to go to the house of the Caesar, of the Kesar. So the women, servants of the Caesar's household would come towards him and sing, Rabba Da'ame, prince of his people, Ma'ad Berana, the Umse, leader of his nation, Butzina de Daira, he's glowing like a candle, Berech Masyach Lishlam, may your arrival be blessed in peace. Okay, going back to the simcha in front of the kala at the wedding, so Yehuda Bar Ilai would take a branch of hadas and he would wave it around as he danced before the bride, saying Kala Nava Chasuda, according to Beis Hillel's approach, saying that the kala is beautiful and charming. Another thing that was done was Rav Shmuel Barav. He would actually juggle 3 hadas branches. Rav Zera was a bit upset about that. He said that he's actually behaving in a way which is not befitting Talmidei Chachamim. But then when Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak passed away, there was a big pillar of fire that blocked between him and everyone else. And we know that that only happens for the one or two top people in the generation. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Zera said, so you see that he was right. Actually, his shituse, which means his branch, got him this covet, that he waved, that he juggled the branches. Some say he didn't say shituse, he said shtuse, his foolishness, something which he had assumed to be foolishness, helped him. And some say he said shitase, his opinion helped him. Either way, he was referring to the fact that his juggling of the hadas branches at the wedding was a tremendous zechus for him, and apparently not something embarrassing. Another thing at a wedding, the Gemara says Rav Achal used to put the kala on his shoulder and dance with her, and the Chachamim said, could we do that too? He said, only if she feels to you just like a beam of wood, meaning you have no sensations, you have no improper thoughts or feelings based on having a woman on your shoulders, then you can. Otherwise, it's not appropriate. Now, on a similar note, the Gemara says that Shmuel bar Nachmani said in Rav Yonasan that you're allowed to look at the face of the kala all 7 days of Sheva Brachas in order that her husband should feel that she's very beautiful, because everybody seems to be unable to keep themselves from staring at her. The Gemara says we do not paskin that way. It is forbidden to look at a woman for your hana, and it's forbidden to stare or to be seen staring, and therefore this is not allowed. All right, now the Gemara goes on to compare the kavod of a kala to that of a mace and that of a melech. So all three of these travel with a large group. A kala was escorted to the hall where the wedding was with a large group in a crowd. A mace goes out, that is a dead person at his funeral, is brought to the grave with a large crowd of people accompanying him, and a king always had a large entourage with him. So if they were all traveling on the same road, they'd get in each other's way, and the parties would get mixed up. You would end up having different groups mingled with each other. So the question is, which group has to allow the other one go, and they have to find a different route. So the Gemara says that the kala takes precedence over the funeral. The funeral has to go find a different route. But the king takes precedence over both of them. If he's traveling along the way, his covet is such that the kala and the funeral have to find a different route. Yet the Gemara says that Agrippas HaMelech, who was Jewish, he was appointed by the Romans to rule. He allowed a kala to go instead of him, and he went a different way. And the Chachamim praised him for that. So the Gemara says, why did they praise him? That's the wrong thing to do. We just said the halacha is that the kala has to give way to the king. Now you'll say maybe he was meichel, he forgave his honor, he waived his proper honor, but that's not correct, because we know that a nasi is allowed to waive his honor, but a king is not. Like it says, Saim tasim alacha melech, you should put a king over you. Saim tasim is a dual expression, Saim tasim, to show that you have to be very careful with the honor of a king. It's important that the people honor him, and he should not give up on his honor that is due him. It's not proper. His honor is not his own. Sumar says, no, the situation here was that people didn't understand. It was not obvious that he was giving up on his covet because it was a crossroads, and people just thought he had to go the other way. Okay. Now, which do I need to go to, or do I need to go to a wedding or to a funeral at all? So the Gemara says you have to even interrupt your learning in order to go out to a funeral and to go to a wedding. You have to show covet for both those things. It was said about Rabbi Yehuda bar Eloi that he would interrupt his learning in order to go out to a levaya and to a wedding. Says the Gemara, this is only true if the wedding party or the funeral does not have the sufficient amount of people. It does not have a shear. It does not have enough people there like it's supposed to have. However, if there's enough people there, then you don't need to show covet. You should keep learning instead. Okay, how much is the shear? This was a brisa, but how much is the shear? So the Gemara talks about a funeral. The Gemara says that the shear for a funeral is 12,000 men and 6,000 men with shofar, blowing shofar, to call people to come to the funeral. There are different versions as to whether it was 12,000 or 13,000, and whether the 6,000 are counted as part of those. So according to the first version, it would be 12,000 plus 6,000, which would be 18,000. According to the second version, it would be 13, including 6,000 of them who have a shofar. And another way of saying it is that if you filled up the entire space from the gates of the city till the grave with people, it should if you stretch the line from there to there, it should be all full. It should be one continuous line of people filling the entire space from the gates of the city to the funeral, to the grave itself. Now, Rav Sheshes, or possibly Rav Yechanan, say that if you're talking about a Talmid Chacham who learned Psukim and Mishnayos, even if he never taught it, so the shir is 600,000 people, and that's because the Torah was given at Har Sinai with 600,000 people. When it's being removed at the death of a person, it should also be with 600,000 people. If it's a person who actually taught others, didn't just learn on his own, but he taught others, then there is no limit. There's never a point at which you say there's enough people there, I don't have to join. The question is that comes up from this Gemara is what happens if somebody didn't learn at all? Rashi says for that there is no minimum, you never have to go. Okay, says the Gemara, we had seen in the Mishnah that there was a hinuma. A hinuma was something that a kala psula had that showed that she was a psula. What is a hinuma? So Gemara gives two explanations. Sorchav bar papa says the name of Zeiri, it is a canopy made of hadas branches, and Rav Yechanan said it's a veil. It's called hinuma from the word menamne, which means to sleep, to snooze. Because it covered her face, the bride was actually able to fall asleep behind it, and nobody would know. All right. Now, the Mishnah had said that that Rav Yechanan ben Broika also said that if they gave out dried grain, which was sweet, if they gave that out at the wedding, there was also a sign that she was a psula. The Gemara says that's true in Yehuda. What about in Bavel? They didn't do that in Bavel. The Gemara says there the simon was that the women would come and rub oil on the heads of the Talmidei Chachamim. So if Papa said to Abaye, what rub oil on the heads of Talmidei Chachamim, what do you mean? They needed to have their hair shampooed? What was the point in that? So Abaye said to Rav Papa, you're orphaned. Now, Abaye himself was an orphan, but he was saying you're orphaned of the customs. You don't know the minhagim. Didn't you have at your wedding, didn't your mother rub oil on the heads of the Talmidei Chachamim? That's the meaning. That's a custom that exists. He even said a specific incident. He said there was when a certain Talmid Chacham made a shidduch between his son and a daughter of Rabbi Bar Ula, or the other way around, there was a son of Rabbi Bar Ula and a daughter of this Talmid Chacham, and they rubbed heads. They rubbed oil on the heads of the Talmid Chachamim during the wedding. All right, the Gemara asks, what about for Almana? Almana, we said, has to have her own simon. So the Gemara said, no, they were just very careful to make sure that there was no grain, and if there was no grain, then that was a sign that she was an almana and not a psula. All right, now the ones are going to go analyze in Rabbi Yeshua's opinion at the end of the Mishnah. That's the end of the Sakarata. Rabbi Yeshua there had said that if a person comes to you and he says, this land that I'm living on used to belong to your father, but I bought it from him, so he's believed, because had he not said anything, you would never have any claim, you would never have anything to even be suspicious of. There's nothing to discuss. Therefore, if he's the one who says it's on his mouth that we have any sugya at all, so on his mouth we trust completely that he actually, not only do we trust him that it once belonged to your father, but we also trust him that he bought it from him. So the Gemara says, why do you have to say this about your father? What if he comes to you and he says, this land used to belong to you and I bought it from you? See, the same thing as well. You wouldn't have any proof or claim otherwise anyway, so he should be believed as well. So the Gemara says, no. We could have said that halacha. That halacha is true. But then we wouldn't have been able to say the next Mishnah, which brings the next halacha, which is that if he doesn't have the only source that he used to belong to you, that let's say you had witnesses that it belongs to you, that it once belonged to you, and this guy comes and says, I bought it from you, then he's not believed to say, I bought it from you. He has to bring proof that he bought it from you, because we're not dependent on his testimony to have any sugi here at all. Now, if that was talking about your father, if you had proof that it used to belong to your father, then this halacha makes sense, because there is a way that there is a chiddush to say that he can't just claim that he bought it from your father. If he says he bought it from you, though, then there's no chiddush. So the Gemara explains and spells out that it's dependent on the halacha of chazaka. Chazaka and cheskes Karkois, which is halacha, which is primarily taught in Maseches Bava Vasra, is that if somebody's living on a land, he's working land, or he's dwelling on a land, or he's living in a house for a period of up to 3 years, and nobody complains, and nobody says, what are you doing on my land? That proves that he bought the land. Somebody can't come later and say, hey, it was mine, because where were you for the last 3 years? And the person no longer has to bring proof that he bought it, because you don't have to hold on to your contract forever. Contracts are hard to keep track of. You could lose them. And therefore, after 3 years, it's proof. If you live on the land for 3 years with no one protesting, it's proof that he owns it. So now, if we're talking about where you go over to someone and you say, this land belonged to you, and he has witnesses, and he says he has proof that the land once belonged to him, and you say, I bought it. So then if you live there for 3 years, so that's good proof, and that's pashut, and you don't need any Mishnah to tell me that. That's a well-known halacha. You have chazaka 3 years. If you didn't have chazaka 3 years, then it's clear that you're not going to be believed to say that, and that's also well known. The other person has witnesses that he once owned it. You have no chazaka. Why should you be believed? Of course you're not. You have to have a proof. You have to have a bill of sale if you bought it from him. So therefore, if this discussion was had between a person and the actual person who he says he bought it from, there would be no way for us to learn this Mishnah. However, if he said that this land used to be your father's, now it makes sense. Because if you had witnesses that it used to be your father's, and this guy says, I bought it, there's a situation in which is a chiddush, and that's where he lived on it for 3 years. But only 2 of those years, for example, were under the father's possession, and 1 year was under the possession of the son. So the chiddush is that 3-year chazaka like that doesn't count. It's not a proof. Because you can't make a chazaka on the son. The year in which the son was supposed to protest against you, the father was gone already. There is no proof in the fact that he didn't protest that the land really belongs to the person who says he bought the land. The son may have not known that it was really his father's. He may have not had proof. He grew up with the understanding that it was his father's, that it wasn't his father's. There's no reason for him to get involved, and there's not any proof against him. The Gemara says that you see this from a statement of Rav Huna, because Rav Huna says you cannot make a chazaka on the property of a katan. You can't live on a child's property and say, well, he didn't protest, so that proves that it's mine. It's not expected that he would protest because he's a child. Same thing is true once a child grows up. The child grew up in the understanding that it wasn't his land. You cannot expect him to protest. If he later gets witnesses or a claim or finds out that he should make a claim that the land is really his, you can't say, well, I lived here for 3 years, he didn't say anything, even though he's an adult. Says Gemara, what's Rav Huna adding to the Mishnah? We said this is pshat in our Mishnah, so what's he adding there? So Gemara says, first of all, the Mishnah wasn't clear, so Rav Huna could be explaining the Mishnah, or he could be adding the halacha that even if he grows up. The Mishnah didn't say if he grows up. The Mishnah may have been just referring to where the child was still a child. That the same thing is true if he grows up. That is an extra chiddush of Rav Huna. Okay, the Gemara says, I understand. You're telling me that we couldn't talk about where it was a dispute between 2 people where he says that I bought this land from you. It has to be where he's saying I bought it from your father, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to say that he loses if there's witnesses that the land once belonged to him. But there is a way which he still could have said a chiddush. Again, in Helchas Chazaka, you didn't have to go to the case of the father. You could have talked about the person himself. What's that? Where he says, I bought this land from you, and I lived on it for 3 years and have a chazaka, but the chazaka doesn't count because the owner had to run away in the middle of the 3 years. And therefore, he wasn't around to claim anything against you. He wasn't around to protest, and it's not a proof that it's yours just because you lived on it for 3 years. The Gemara says, no. This is not a possible case at all, because what is the situation exactly? What happened? If it is that why did he run away? If he ran away because the country was trying to kill him, the government was after him, he couldn't protest, and therefore it's not a proof at all. If he ran away because people owed him, because he owed people money and they were claiming against him and they were giving him a hard time, then he still should have protested, and it is a good proof, because just because he went somewhere else, so he didn't have to flee, he wasn't afraid for his life, he went somewhere else, fine, so he's out of town, but you should still make a protest from somewhere else, because we have a rule that even if you're not in town, you still protest wherever you are, and the word gets back to the person who's there, and it registers the protest against him. Where do we see that? So we see that in a Mishnah. There's a Mishnah that says Eretz Yisrael is divided into 3 lands, Yehuda, Eretz Yisrael, and Evar Yarden, the other side of the Jordan River. And these divisions is to show that chazaka doesn't work from one place to another. If you're in one place and the owner of the land is in a different region, you can't say, well, he didn't protest and therefore I have a proof. The fact that he was in a different region, that doesn't prove anything. And the Gemara there explains, why not? If we're talking about if we're holding that word will travel, and therefore you could protest somewhere else. So then what's the difference which region you're in? And if word won't travel, so then even if you're in the same region, it's not going to travel. So what's the significance of these three lands? So we said that the significance is that word doesn't travel across these three borders. And the same is true anywhere where word doesn't travel, where you can't get word across because there's hostilities between the areas, whatever it is. So therefore, we know that word does travel. So generally we say that unless there's a specific situation where word's not going to travel because people don't go, then we assume that you do have to protest somewhere else. So this guy who ran away would still have to protest, and he would not have a claim that I have a chazakah based on the fact that he didn't say anything.